Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's edition of the In a Nutshell podcast. It's October 4th, 2023. This is episode 11. It'll be our week 6 preview, and then a couple more schedules we'll look into for college basketball. As usual, I'm your host, Sean Vowells, and I'll be joined by Joe Meade. Joe, we're going to go right to Friday night in the Big Ten. We've got a game between two teams that are winless in the conference. That's Nebraska. They'll be visiting Illinois. It'll be 8 o'clock on FS1. Anything else from this game other than both teams really need to win this?
Yeah, there's not much else besides that. I really think this will be a very ugly game. I think the goal for each team is to not turn the ball over. Again, you could hit me on the head and call me Captain Obvious there, but both teams have really struggled, particularly both Harburg, Sims, and Altmaier. And I know what you're going to say about Harburg. He only struggled with turnovers against Michigan, but let's face it, that was practically the real first team he faced. And Illinois, though their defense has been lackluster, I don't think a first-year quarterback is going to love going against Brett Bielema in any kind of way, Sean. So, this will be the first weekend, and this will be a recurring theme where you're kind of going to get real fall weather. Last week at the Big Ten, it was warm days. You probably saw some day attire on some of the fans, excluding even the college students who always seem to wear the crazy outfits. Um, but going to be mid 50s. This game, I assume, will kick in the low 50s, go to the 40s, but not going to be the boring first date and talk all about weather, but something to definitely consider as we get into the first real week of October. So, again, both teams 0-2 in the conference, can't afford a loss. I'd say the key to this game, besides turnovers, Sean, is whoever could get the running game going. Nebraska has a few more options. I do think they have a few more playmakers. They really had Billy Kemp go off last week again, not go off, but do some nice things against Michigan, and tickets are as low as $6 according to StubHub. So, you know, maybe go out, support your team, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of Nebraska red in this Friday Night Illini crowd. And one last thing, just to address a future question, I do not like Friday Night Lights, especially at this point of the year. I kind of think it's like the 28-year-old reliving homecoming for high school, coming into the pre-photos and rooting it. That's what I would give the analogy as. But getting off that shot, let's get into more matchups.
Yeah, both teams coming off very, very big losses, and they really need a W. We'll turn the page to Saturday, noon kickoff on Fox. That'll be Maryland going to Ohio State. Ohio State almost 3 touchdown favorites, 20 points. Maryland has been pretty impressive this year, but there's no reason for Ohio State not to roll in this one, right?
Yeah, Sean, I think a lot of pundits around, I wouldn't say around the country, I would say probably more on the podcast forum. I'm not going to name other Big Ten podcasts here and try to yell at them because I do ultimately listen to them as well. They're saying this could be a matchup. I think Maryland definitely has the offensive capabilities to keep up. Where I think they're weakest when it comes to matching up with Ohio State is the interior lines and, frankly, their entire defensive and offensive line, Sean. Mike Locksley is one heck of a play caller. He's one heck of a coach. He's got a heck of an offensive staff with, Gaddis, Sumlin. I know the book's still out on both of them, but, you know, these are teams that probably playmaking is going to be a big theme in this game, whether it's close or not. Ohio State is the 20-point favorite. I really have a hard time thinking Ohio State off a bye is going to come out anything but not firing, especially after the bye week they had. And again, a great bye week where Ryan Day was probably the talk of college football with his feud with, let's just say, slightly senile Lou Holtz. I don't want to put my name attached to that quote, but I see what I see. Biggest key for Maryland in this game, shot to even keep it competitive, is they cannot fall down early to Ohio State. I think if I'm Maryland, you have to do the classic Lincoln Riley in 2018. The lesson he learned was if you win the toss, you're the dog, you got an offense, you got to jump on Ohio State. You got to copy the formula Michigan over the last 2 years has done. You're not going to be able to get to a firefight with them the way Georgia last year was, Sean. So I think key for Maryland is jump on them early. And Talia Tagovailoa, he's known to turn over the ball against some of these bigger teams and to rush and make some rash decisions. He can absolutely not do that even once in this game because you cannot give Ohio State and Ryan Day a short field. Big noon kickoff is going to be here, Sean. I think this will be a great environment for Ohio State. This is probably their second biggest home game of the year, besides the showdown they have with Penn State coming up at the 21st. So, I think this could be a really entertaining game. Might not be a close game, but there's going to be a lot of playmakers all over the field. And if you just want to argue and say there's no playmakers, just look at Marvin Harrison Jr. And that's reason enough to tune in, Sean.
So there is another game at noon. Will definitely be watched by far fewer people, and that's between Rutgers and Wisconsin in Madison. That'll be on Peacock. Wisconsin 13-point favorites. I'm a little surprised that is so high. Rutgers has been impressive at times this year. We saw them. They've really looked good in every game but the Michigan game, and Wisconsin 3-1 on the year. The only team in the Big Ten West without a loss.
A funny game. I think Rutgers is obviously in year four of Shiano, Wisconsin year one of Fickle, but they're very similar teams. They both want to run the ball. They're both defensive minded teams. Again, everyone's going to scream about the Longo hire. I don't think Wisconsin can ever stray from the fact that they're going to have to roll, especially when you have the one of the best running backs in the country, Braylon Allen. This is a really funny game to me. I definitely feel like it's more must win for because they need to bring on that because they are probably better than most of the teams play in the West, but tougher matchups simply because Rutgers is not going to turn the ball over a lot. They don't make a lot of mistakes. They don't commit a lot of penalties. And that's going to be the biggest key for Rutgers. Continue to do what you do well. Don't make big mistakes. Don't make the big turnover. Continue to run the ball. Give the ball to a non-guy. Hopefully, you could get your playmakers in space. And I think they have to get turnovers to win this game, Sean. I think this could be a very competitive game. I'm expecting it to actually be a very competitive game. The key for Rutgers is doing what they do best. That's limiting big plays, no turnovers. And for Wisconsin, I think the key is get out to a two-score lead. And frankly, whoever gets out to a two-score lead in this game, Sean, I see winning the game. So those are probably the three biggest keys for me.
So we'll move to 3:30 on Peacock. Howard Northwestern is at 3 on BTN, but we're not going to waste any time talking about that. Purdue and Iowa, 3:30 on Peacock. Iowa, the home team, 2-point favorites. So essentially a toss-up here. Purdue 2-3 on the year. Iowa 4-1. Iowa first game without their quarterback. After ended up being a pretty nice home win last week against Michigan State, despite them really being on the ropes for the first three quarters. And Purdue has really been unimpressive this year. So, Joe, how do you think this one's going to go down in the in Kinnick Stadium?
Well, I think one thing to keep in mind, Sean, and for anyone disputing that Purdue can't win on the road, they did it 2 years ago with a far better Iowa team that was actually ranked number three. That was probably the biggest win on paper of the Jeff Brom era in West Lafayette. They went in there and smoked them. I believe the final score was 24-7. That was probably the beginning of when people really thought Iowa's offense was frankly fraudulent. And we come to find out 2 years later that that assessment's pretty correct. Deacon Hill, his first start, he'll definitely look better than he did on Saturday, not because the bar is low, but because he's got a full week of first team reps. I'm sure he's found some more comfortability with his targets. Purdue, man, I think Hudson Card looked really good last week. I think the way they performed in the second half, getting their playmakers in space, and just dominating, putting a stranglehold on Illinois was really impressive. I think Purdue's going to have to do that in this game because, game at Kinnick is a game at Kinnick. I don't care that they did it 2 years ago. Iowa's defense is still Iowa's defense. Phil Parker is still Phil Parker. Purdue, the biggest key to this is to probably win first down because once they get to 2nd and 5, 2nd and 6, they can really vary what they do, and they could probably live in 3rd and short because they could keep Iowa on their toes. Where Iowa gets good is if they make you a false start, they make you go 3rd and obvious passing downs, and that's probably what costed Michigan State the game. I got a few DMs and after Monday's show, Sean, really not probably crediting Iowa a little too much and not discrediting MSU enough, whatever. Point is, don't false start, don't commit penalties there because Iowa is happy to live in 3rd and 5 and longer. And that's when Phil Parker is really dangerous. And that's frankly when you turn the ball over against Iowa. Hudson Card, certainly has not protected the ball all that well. He did have a great game last week, but kind of a similar theme, Sean. Purdue can't turn the ball over, but I think the bigger theme of the game is going to be make Iowa go down the field and score on you. With Iowa's offense, that's been a recurring theme, but with Deacon Hill, his first real start against a real team, uh, I think Purdue has to make a burn every inch. So I think the line of two is just about right in this game. And frankly, Sean, I can see this going into overtime. I think Iowa was very close to an overtime game last week. I'd be shocked if they didn't get into one of the next few weeks, Sean.
Yeah, Iowa did end up kind of pulling away from Michigan State last week with some field goals and a kicker punt return. So the offense only scoring one touchdown there. So that'll be something to look out for too. Last game of the night, Joe, 7:30 on NBC. Your Wolverines head to Minnesota to face the Golden Gophers. 19-point favorites, coming off a nice road win last week. Any reason why it shouldn't happen again?
I'll just address one thing, Sean. My friend Drew texted me why we weren't covering Northwestern. I just want to say I'm wearing a Wrigleyville sweatshirt, so that's as close to Northwestern as we're going to get on this podcast. Getting back to the main point at hand, Sean. This is a classic case of, and you can hear PJ Fleck's press conference from the other day, of a team playing a team they want to be exactly like. And by that I mean Minnesota, PJ Fleck, they're based on culture, big program kind of program guy is a phrase that's thrown around too often, but I'd say PJ Fleck's probably the biggest emphasis on that. Um, Minnesota's a team that wants to run the ball. They want to play excellent defense, and that's exactly what Michigan does well. So I'd kind of call this junior versus senior matchup in terms of maybe even a mentor versus student matchup. I think PJ Fleck's been outspoken about his admiration for Harbaugh. With all that said, I think they do have enough playmakers to put a scare into Michigan, particularly Darius Taylor, just a freshman, and another freshman, Sean, last week, who played very well against Louisiana. I understand that game was a little too scary, but Zach Evans, not to be mistaken with the Zach Evans from TCU or Ole Miss last year, but two freshmen, man, as running backs. You know, a lot of people have been criticizing PJ Fleck, particularly after the Northwestern loss. I think he's got a really good roster. I think there's a lot of young guys, particularly the two running backs, and even Sean Tyler, the grad transfer they got. I think they could eventually develop into having a three-headed monster toward the end of the year. With all that said, that's what they're going to have to be in this game. They're going to have to get some control of the line of scrimmage on offense, and if they could, burst out 4 or 5 yards a pop like they have in past games, and you know, give Calic Manis, again, I can't pronounce the name well. I don't think any analyst in the country can. Give him some more comfortable throws instead of being under the barrel on 3rd and 5 and longer. I think that's how Minnesota could make this competitive to pull off the upset. But Michigan, Sean, has not lost in Minneapolis in over 50 years. Michigan's lost to Minnesota, but they've all been at home. And I would say, Sean, the biggest key for Michigan is to just not massively mess up. And there are certainly other phrases I could have used, but I do not want to get here. JJ McCarthy's been playing a lot better. Blake Corum seems to be his old self. Probably the only thing Michigan fans want to watch out for is injuries, to see if maybe Mason Graham comes back in there. He will have some kind of block around his hand since it's probably half broken. And then finally to see if Donovan Edwards can get going. That's probably the biggest storylines you'll see in this game. But it's safe to say this is not the game of the day in college football. Perhaps not even the game of the day in the Big Ten with Maryland and Ohio State. But Sean, frankly, Michigan should run away with this one. Minnesota is going to have to hit a bunch of big plays, and Michigan would have to put out a TCU performance in not protecting the ball for this to be competitive. So that's as honest as I could be with our viewers.
So that's our Week 6 preview here. Penn State is on bye among a couple other teams that we didn't talk about. Before we go to Hoops, Joe, remind the listeners to check out jerseykings.com. You can use our code on the screen for 15% off. It's jersey-kings.com. So be sure to check that out. And we're going to head into The schedules of Maryland and Indiana, Joe. So we're going to throw the Maryland roster up first. Kevin Willard will be in year 2. And the top 3 names that you see on the roster are the big 3 that returned from a year ago: Jameer Young, Donta Scott, and Julian Reese. And you see there senior, junior. And Julian Reese has played a whole lot of basketball for a junior. So you got a couple freshmen in there. You get Jordan Geronimo from Indiana. But any thoughts on the Maryland roster here? Because last year making the tournament certainly looks like they can make the step up.
I think there's some similarity to Wisconsin in that you probably have three of your best players back in Young, Scott, and Reese. Um, Again, plenty of new faces. I understand Geronimo's experience in the conference, but plenty of freshmen, sophomores that we really haven't seen much or any of, Sean. I think these guys' roles, Young, Scott, and Reese, is gonna be so big, not just on the court, but off it too. It's probably already transpired in College Park, probably all the teaching moments. And I really think Kevin Willard last year was my low-key Big Ten Coach of the Year. I often alluded to it besides the obvious in Matt Painter, but I think he did a really nice job. I think this is a really critical year for them to keep it going, and I think you have to bubble wrap all three of those guys in practice, Sean, because those guys are. I think that three in the conference are probably some of the most important players as a package. If we rank them, and I'm sure we will, in the entire Big Ten because of the experience they bring and what they meant to Maryland last year.
Yeah, so before we take a quick look at their schedule, remember the Maryland Terrapins that played in College Park were way different than the team that left that stadium. They were horrible on the road, and they were fantastic at home. So hopefully you get a little more consistency there. So we'll go into the schedule here. They start off with Mount St. Mary's and Davidson, and both those games are not supposed to be close. We're going to start, so the Villanova game being on the top allows us to fit the whole thing into the graphic here. So they do have a little bit of a weaker non-conference schedule than the typical teams that we've gone over the last couple times, but their two main tests in the non-conference are on the road at Villanova, a team that's supposed to be a lot better this year, and on the road at UCLA, a team that beat them by 30 at home last year. So Joe, any thoughts about this non-conference schedule and how do you think it'll affect them in the long term?
I think there's two ways to look at this. I think I will give Kevin Willard the benefit of the doubt. He lost plenty of games at Seton Hall that were frankly stupid of him to lose. Not that he was intentionally trying to lose, but there were losses that costed his team down the road when it came to March. I think he'll emphasize that. I think those three veteran guys will not let complacency seep into that locker room. But I really think it's a good thing because of all those new faces that are going to have to learn together. And, some people will go by the Izzo effect that maybe you learn more when you're playing better teams like Kansas and Duke early on, and then your freshmen struggle. But I really believe with these guys, it's good to get them in a groove and good to not baptize them by fire, phrase I use a lot into college basketball by maybe, Maryland's often played, maybe they play at Georgetown or at Virginia. That's playing if those are one of your first games and you're a true freshman, I'm sure you're excited, but when you make mistakes and then the crowd goes crazy, that's something you cannot replicate. And um certainly one thing I will pass if I were to be the wise old man. But Sean, let's get into the meat of their schedule here.
Yep, so baptism by fire in their terms of their Big Ten start, Joe, at Assembly Hall to start it off, and then probably the easiest game on paper in the Big Ten this year, Penn State at home. Any comments on that or the rest of their Big Ten schedule? Looks like they might have a couple of tough stretches, but overall, it doesn't look like they have any serious gauntlets in the Big Ten.
I think starting away at Assembly Hall is definitely not ideal, but I can't think of a better bounce back game, and I'm not going to draw the game at Assembly Hall as a loss. I'm just going to assume it is because of what Maryland showed us last year on the road, Sean. But I think that stretch, Penn State, Alcorn State, Nicholls State, right before you play, by all means, a house money game at UCLA is going to be really good for this young team. And then, once you get to mid-January to even probably the end of February, you know, you're going to learn a lot about your team really quickly and a lot about those young guys and frankly the depth you're going to have.
Yeah, so like we said, there's not like a 3 or 4 game stretch where they're all really tough, but that probably 9 or 10 game stretch there will have 7 or 8 tough games, and we've seen teams kind of go quiet through long stretches like that, and you end up not getting a couple games that you should, and then the games that you shouldn't win become a whole lot tougher. So we'll turn the page to, we're just about at 20 minutes, Joe. So we'll turn the page to IU here before we'll get into some
Also,
questions.
Sean, real quick,
Go ahead, Joe.
before we do, I'm just going to read for some of the podcast listeners. The stretch we're talking about is so they open up Indiana, Penn State. They have the break. Then, then their brutal stretch is following their home game against Michigan. It goes Illinois, at Northwestern, home against Michigan State, away to Iowa, home to Nebraska, away to Michigan State, home to Rutgers, away to Ohio State, home to Iowa, home to Illinois, away to Wisconsin, away to Rutgers. That was the lightning round version of that brutal stretch, but definitely worth mentioning and probably don't see way too many wins in there, but I'm going to leave that open for your thoughts.
So one spot below them in the Bart Torvik rankings is Indiana. Mike Woodson, year 3, back-to-back tournament appearances. But Joe, this roster is going to look a whole lot different from last year. They bring in, they lose one of the best players in program history in Trace Jackson Davis, a couple other role players. But the point guard, Xavier Johnson, does come back. He broke his foot against Kansas last year, and he might be the glue that holds this thing together because you got new faces like Anthony Walker and Peyton Sparks, Kel'el Ware, Mackenzie Mbako, and then you have a couple of other role players in Malik Renew and Trey Galloway coming back. But Joe, as an outside fan, there's no doubt that there's talent on this team, probably with that could stack up against anyone, but it's going to be about mixing that up and coming out a team because a lot of that talent's in the front court. And, the starting lineups have been floating around, but, it seems like Mbako is probably going to have to start at the 3, and he's not really a 3, he's probably a 4. So there's a ton of talent here in the front court, but it really just comes down to whether they can make shots and how well the guards play. But is there a player more important to their team in the Big Ten than Xavier Johnson?
Absolutely not, Sean. And I'm gonna really give you the floor on this since this is your team and your area expertise. I think Indiana is one of the most talented teams in the conference, but they are also up there with one of the most speculative teams. Probably right up there with Michigan, Penn State. Not in terms of their performance, but in terms of what we don't know about them. They have, I'd say, a wide range of what we could see probably come December once Michigan and Indiana tip off.
So we'll go into their schedule here. They do have a relatively easy start. Florida Gulf Coast and Army are the ones that are cut off. Then Wright State before they head to New York to play in whatever that 4-team tournament is called. They do play UConn. And they will play the winner or loser of Texas and Louisville the following day. So you have a really tough stretch there. And then Harvard in a neutral before Big Ten play starts against Maryland and Michigan. And then after that, you got Auburn on a neutral. I believe that is in Georgia, so maybe a slight edge there to Auburn. And then Kansas at home. That is an extremely difficult stretch of games, which includes that two-game start to the Big Ten and then some of the household names like Auburn and Kansas.
Yeah, Sean, I don't think you're going to find two bigger games on their schedule besides Maryland and Michigan prior to the new year. I understand everyone circles the game against Kansas, but Indiana's goal probably is they want to hang some kind of a banner this year. I don't know if that's their main goal. There's definitely something in March, but Indiana, it's been, Sean, correct me if I'm wrong, it's probably been 8 years since they've hung a banner, right? The meaningful one, anyway.
15, they... Yeah,
15, 16.
15,
Yeah.
16, they won the regular season.
Yeah, Sean, I think starting off 2-0 is extremely realistic, especially with a home game against Maryland. And I really feel like that away game against Michigan is probably going to be one of the more entertaining and insightful games you'll have all year because of all the new faces, and we'll get into Michigan later. But, Sean, probably take it away on their January half of the schedule. I want to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, it seems like that middle of January to middle of February stretch that we've talked about as a tough spot for some other teams. Looks like it might be a little light in the schedule here. You've got some home games against teams that we project to be at the bottom of the conference, and then some away games against teams that are near the bottom, like Penn State and Minnesota there at the end. So I think if Indiana does their work early, they could finish a little bit higher than we might think here. Obviously, that tough stretch in there with there are the tough away games. Rutgers, Wisconsin, Indiana hasn't won there. I don't think in our lifetime, Joe. And then Illinois away, that's always tough. And then Mackey is tough too. So you got some easier home games, but some really tough away games. So we'll see how they balance that. I don't know if first or second is in the cards for Indiana, but I could easily see this team finishing third because it may not take that many wins. You think 12 wins might be third place in this conference. So it certainly looks like there's a path for a little consistency rather than lose 5 and then win 5 of 6 and then lose 3 of 4. It seems like they should be able to keep the tough losing stretches out with this schedule, at least from my point of view.
Yeah, Sean. Again, for our viewers, there's really not a need to read off a stretch of games. It's probably their opening and kind of closing stretch that sticks out to me, which is away at Rutgers. But then you get home against Minnesota, then home Purdue, away Wisconsin. So there's probably maybe 3 of those 4 games are losable, but it's not like you got 4 in a row where I can go, oh, Indiana's could probably lose all 4. And then the last 4 games, home to Wisconsin, winnable, away to Maryland, that's really tough. Away to Minnesota, extremely winnable. And then home to Michigan State, which I think for senior day in Assembly Hall, that place will be rocking. I think that, Sean, that could be, this is said so early, one of the more important games of the conference. Maybe not for title ramifications, but in terms of, tournament, conference, and then probably a resume boosting win for each of those teams, Sean. So Indiana, I think it's a fairly light schedule. I say that cautiously simply because we don't know what certain teams like Nebraska and Michigan could be, but certainly not as intimidating as the schedule, Wisconsin or Michigan State or frankly Maryland, who we just talked about, has. So I think very good for Indiana in terms of being a top 4 team. And if they're not a top 4 team, certainly plenty enough schedule where they can take their bumps and bruises and then bounce back.
Yeah, so like you said, Joe, about the unbalanced schedule. Remember, there's 14 teams in 20 games. Last year, Purdue, pretty much all of their teams they had to play twice, except for Indiana, were on the bottom of the conference, and Indiana had only one team not in the top half that they got to play twice. So a little bit of an imbalance there. It looks like Indiana might get the other part of that. Obviously, we could be wrong. Nobody imagined Ohio State being the second worst team in the conference last year, but there they were. So that's the Indiana schedule. We're just about at 27 minutes, Joe, so we probably have time for 3 or 4 questions here.
Yeah, Sean, perfect. This one comes in from our buddy Ryan again, the big Penn State and Steelers fan. Joe, what do you make of the comments Manny Diaz made today? And he's definitely talking about the comments that Manny Diaz, Sean, for all your basketball nuts. He was pretty much insinuating he was liking what he saw from Ohio State on film, which implies that Penn State's defense may have a fun day. I don't really advise that kind of smack talk, especially 3 weeks before you play them. I do not think the Hayes Athletic Center will not feature that quote. Definitely not a great idea from him, but if it works out, then I will eat my words, as will a lot of Buckeye fans in those comments. So let's get to a basketball question, Sean. This one's from Brendan, an Ohio State fan asking a basketball question. I love it. Thanks for your question, Brendan. Sean, last year Ohio State lost to Minnesota at home, and that really derailed their season. Besides Minnesota, who else in the Big Ten would you lose to this year that would derail your season? Good question.
I think Penn State's the only answer because there's a lot of ways that they can really, really struggle this year. They've got virtually no Big Ten experience, like we've said, and they've got a new coach. A lot of A-10 quality players from that VCU team that ended up winning the tournament, if I'm not mistaken. But The A10 was down last year, and I think that I did say like I wouldn't be surprised for Penn State to pull one off of their 3 or 4 wins that they're going to get. One of them being away at a team that's going to go dancing, and I certainly think that that's it because there's very few games in this Big Ten that you can kind of expect a win, and that is one of them. And you have to win games that are like that because there's a chance that that could be a quad 3 game, and that is really, really bad come Selection Sunday. And, of course, Minnesota also, as he mentioned.
Yeah, and let's end it with a basketball one, Sean. This one could be a kind of long answer. It's a really interesting question. It's interesting to keep in mind. This is from Mason, who I assume has got to be a Purdue IU fan. He's got a Colts Pacers thing. Um, who do you think will have the greatest attendance of fans at the Big Ten tournament in Minneapolis this year? Ooh, great question. That's tough.
That is tough.
Won't be Minnesota.
Won't be
No offense,
Minnesota.
Minnesota.
Wisconsin's not too far away.
No, Wisconsin.
Proximity-wise, definitely Wisconsin, but in terms of just sheer volume of fans, IU fans are everywhere, Michigan fans are everywhere, Michigan State fans are everywhere. Probably one of those three, but there won't be a distinct advantage like a Chicago Big Ten tournament would be for the Illinois teams or an Indiana tournament for Purdue or IU. But I would have to go with Wisconsin or the three big names that, frankly, the tournament could be in Hawaii and they'd still have fans.
Yeah, I don't want to even answer further. I think it would have to be some combo of Wisconsin, Michigan State, Indiana. I'd throw Purdue in there too. I don't know
Yeah.
if you included them. Um, Again, I think Ben Johnson's gonna have to pull a rabbit out of his hat to keep his job, and maybe if they have a strong enough showing in the regular season, whatever that may be, they get some Gopher fans there. But I think one of the more weird locations. I know they had Madison Square Garden and DC, but there's plenty of Michigan and Penn State, Maryland, whatever alum in that area, simply because they're the big metro areas of the country, Sean. So I think that's something we're going to have to study further as we get closer to the Big Ten tournament. That's a great question. Thank you, Mason.
Because one of those teams may not have a team worth going to see, and
Yeah.
you highly doubt that for a Michigan State. But Ohio State travels fairly well, and if they are really bad again, then why would their fans waste their money to go to Minneapolis? It's not very close to Columbus, so
Especially in mid-March where it's still cold as yeah.
it
Not
wouldn't.
gonna say it.
It's an interesting Big Ten tournament. We'll see if they do it again. I think, for at least the last 4 or 5 years, bounced back and forth between Chicago and Indy. We'll see. I certainly am okay with really anywhere. I mean, it's the Big Ten tournament. It's not really all that important for anything other than hanging a banner. Bubble teams, maybe one, if they win their first game, will get in, but it's not like a one bid league where that tournament is basically everything that's mattered for the entire season. But it will be interesting because there won't be a distinct advantage like there usually is.
Yeah, no, I think that wraps it up for questions. I saw a lot of Peacock DMs that came in right before we started our show. We could talk about that next week. We'll get a better list of games for you, and then I could read off some G-rated angry texts. I have no problem doing that, but save the R and other rated stuff for your group chat. It's not here.
So that's all we have for you today. Thanks for tuning in to our Week 6 preview and college basketball schedule look. We'll be back on Monday with the Week 6 recap and then 2 more schedules. So thanks for tuning in.